Thank you for joining us today on the Desert Sanctuary.
Remember, all that wander in the desert are not lost. We hope that you know
You are seen
you are heard
and you are loved. Hi, welcome to the Desert Sanctuary podcast. I'm Karl Forehand. I'm here with Karl, and it's just the two of us tonight, which is kind of
Winston
becoming...
the Wonder Dog. He gets upset when you don't mention his name.
Oh, well, sorry.
He really doesn't contribute much. He's just down there sleeping somewhere.
Right.
Being wonderful. Mm-hmm. He's had a cyst removed, so he's recovering.
Yeah. He's good, though.
Yeah,
he's good.
He's doing good.
He's not too down and out because of it. He's doing all right.
It's just his natural state. He's kind of low-key.
Yeah.
Most of the time.
For sure.
Except when the postal lady comes to visit every day.
Or the UPS truck or FedEx truck
Anyone
drives by.
delivering anything is suspect.
And usually not usually, but sometimes it's even stuff for him. You think he'd be nicer about it.
I know.
When his dog food comes or his bones come.
Or the UPS guy leaves him...
He leaves him a bone.
Treats.
Yeah, he leaves him a bone. Still, he's a jerk. Not the UPS guy, Winston.
Yeah, we're not sure about the UPS guy.
He seems pretty nice.
Yeah.
Anyway, what are we talking about tonight?
Talking about healing from religious trauma. Mm-hmm. Before I talk about that, we want to tell you that we're doing a Leaning Forward conference, e-conference, on December 9th, which will come out shortly after this podcast. So on December 9th, there'll be about 9 or 10 speakers. And I say that because it's just now coming together. We've just been working on it a few days, but already we got some great speakers, and it's all women this time.
Yeah.
So, in light of some other things that have happened, we just felt like that was the right thing to do right now at this time. And so we're busy getting all that together and getting things recorded. We'll be ready for it, and we can announce speakers later on.
Honestly, when is it not the right time to have all women speakers?
I know, right?
Any time is the right time for that.
I think you and I both are about amplifying women's voices, and we're just about sick and tired of the patriarchy and all of that stuff. I'm not going to quit talking, but I'll gladly give up my seat almost any time to let someone that's a woman, that's female. I'm not sure how to say all that anymore, but just to allow them to speak.
Or just to make a place, to make room for other voices to be heard that have not been heard for a very long time, which are mainly women's voices.
Right. And so I'm deeply interested in that. So whatever I can do to help that along, then we're going to try to do it. Right?
Yeah.
But tonight we're going to talk about healing religious trauma, which is kind of the topic of that seminar, that e-conference, and that they will go into more detail. But this is our shot from our understanding for the Desert Sanctuary, our understanding of religious trauma. So what is religious trauma?
Well, religious trauma is the result of different experiences that occur in a religious community within a church or spiritual community that exposes the members to indoctrination messages, coercion, humiliation, embarrassment, and abuse. And that's a quote from Julia Schwab, who is a therapist, I'm assuming. Yeah. Is that correct? Yeah.
Yeah. So, the Global Center for Religious Research, GCRR.org, who we've interviewed the leader of that group. In their studies, they estimate 1/3, 1 out of every 3 people have experienced religious trauma. How does that strike you?
It's surprising and it's not surprising. You know, I think when I was still in church, I would have thought, no way.
Right.
You know, and even when we first started our deconstruction journey, I honestly thought I was one of very few people who had experienced any type of religious trauma. So, but the more we've been out here in the desert, the more that statistic does not surprise me.
Yeah. And a lot of people, I think, just don't know why you're involved in something, why you're deep in it, whether that's a family or a church or a religious organization. When you're deep inside it, it's hard to see it. Like we talked about with the ocean and the water, and when you're too close to the water, you can't see it. But, it's real easy for us to imagine now, especially everyone coming out of religion seems to have some form of religious trauma. And when you look from the outside looking in without all the distractions, you see it inside there also with the people that stayed. And a lot of times people say, I've never seen religious trauma. And that's just because they're too close to it. They may be the one inflicting it, but it is there, and it's becoming more recognized, and we're having more discussions and more education on trauma-informed things, and you're very involved in all that. So let's do our best to talk about our understanding and have a discussion tonight.
Okay.
And then in a couple of weeks, there'll be an e-conference that really dives into it deep.
Right.
So religious trauma can look like deep or chronic shame about being personally responsible for Christ's death, being a sinner, or not living up to expectations.
It's also having feelings of unworthiness, being unlovable or bad in some way.
Again, these are all from the GCR, the Global Center for Religious Research. Fear of rejection by God or the faith community.
Lack of self-compassion.
Lack of personal autonomy. An ingrained belief that one's life is for God's sole purpose, leading to challenges, making decisions, creating personal boundaries, and providing intentional consent.
Feelings that they can't trust themselves, their body, or their emotions.
Growing up with chronic fear or anxiety around salvation, rapture, hell, Satan, or demons. Growing up with chronic fear and anxiety about those things.
Yeah, and superstitious beliefs about what will lead to positive and negative outcomes in life.
And perfectionism or hypervigilance, the fear of making mistakes.
Extreme dualistic thinking, judging every individual thought and action as good or bad.
Spiritual bypassing, denying the presence and validity of mental health issues due to a belief that those feelings come from Satan or a lack of faith, or if we pray enough or are favored enough, then God will take it away.
Difficulty with experiencing pleasure.
Feeling bad or wrong for having sexual thoughts or feelings, or having physical reactions to sexual situations, such as crying or feeling a disconnect from the body.
Denying sexuality.
And lasting trauma from conversion therapy. Yeah, we have friends there. We know some people.
For sure.
And that's a pretty good list, isn't it?
Yeah.
Wouldn't you say?
Yeah, and you shared that list with me as we were driving down the road, and in my head I kept going, yep.
Yeah.
We've experienced that. We've experienced that. Oh, I've experienced that for sure. So, conversion therapy is probably the only one on that list that I've not personally experienced in my own life. But like you said, we do know people that have had trauma because of that. Yeah,
very lasting impact on them. And a lot of these things, I think a lot about my junior high because I went to a private Christian school. It was probably Gothard influenced. It was evangelical. It was the worst of the worst.
Yeah.
And I went to school for several years in the private Christian school, and went to that church, went to summer camp, went on tours with the choir and stuff and that thing. And definitely experienced all those things.
Right.
To different degrees. And then as pastor and wife we had our own struggles there, the own kind of trauma there that got inflicted on us, and you're just trying to survive, I think, and you think that's where you're supposed to be, and a lot of it you don't realize at the time or until later.
Right.
And sometimes when you do try to bring it up, it gets dismissed. So we'll talk about that in a minute. But let's mention a few ways we did experience religious trauma. And so, for most of us, there's the doctrine of hell, demons, Satan, hell, punishment. Don't do it right, you're in trouble, right?
Right.
So we've experienced that. And I remember preaching about some of those things and even having a softer view of some of those things while I was preaching and having to apologize for having that softer belief from the pulpit. So even when I didn't totally believe it, it was still the default.
Right.
Oh, if you're wrong, Karl, then this is true. But those things traumatize children. They traumatize adults. We're just afraid of going down the wrong path, making a mistake.
Yeah. And then, also we experienced the whole fear and control. We just re-listened to our podcast on parenting that, came out. And, just having that, just even in our parenting, that fear and control, we are so afraid that our kids are going to make a mistake or embarrass us or do something that the church wouldn't approve of. And so we, by default, then try to control their behavior. And we do that inside the church too. I mean,
it's damage control.
Damage control. I remember, several counseling sessions where we counseled people, and it's almost like, I feel like you were very had a lot of compassion for people, but there was always that underlying, well, we got to kind of get a handle on this, right? Because, we don't want our church to look bad. We don't want our denomination to look bad. It really didn't have as much to do with having true compassion and true love for people while they are hurting. Yeah.
Another thing we dealt with that we just weren't aware of, I think, the whole idea in the Baptist church, at least, was that men are the heads of the household and so on. There's a definite patriarchy, and even in some more liberal denominations, there still seems to be a patriarchy. There's that controlling faction. It's usually white. Usually male, usually cisgender. It's the controlling party. It's the people that are the most upset right now because they're losing some of that.
Right.
And but there's that patriarchy and privilege that we never realized we had as white people, and those things create trauma. It was traumatizing to me that there's an inner circle to churches when we just attended them and we weren't the pastor. And I could see that circle and that privilege and that just the way it hurt me, not to be recognized for my abilities, not to be included, but just, they counted on me for money and volunteer labor, but they were in charge.
Right.
And so it wasn't a discussion.
Right. Yeah. So then also, another facet is narcissists or narcissism, the need to be center stage, addicted, just like the congregation. So, you can speak from the pastor's perspective, but, many times, just kind of as a bystander, I mean, I know I was the pastor's wife, but I kind of saw just the level of, I don't know what the word is, but just how much people wanted to put you on a pedestal. And that, I didn't know why at the time, but that scared me. I thought, that is dangerous. I couldn't express why I thought it was dangerous, but I was just like, this is so dangerous, because as soon as Karl does something, and I don't know, I need to examine, maybe I need some serious like therapy to see where this comes from in me, because for some reason I could foresee that. Like, as soon as Karl does something that they disagree with, they're going to kick the pedestal out from under him, and this is all going to come tumbling down. And for sure that is what happened. And like, I don't know how I had that.
They tried to, at least.
Well, right. Okay, yeah, let's clarify that.
I'm pretty stubborn.
Yeah, no, but to be fair, I mean, they tried.
Yeah.
And they tried many different facets. Angles. And so when they couldn't really move you or phase you, they would come after me, or they would go through our children or something like that. Yeah. So,
and you've mentioned that before. You've noticed that, and you also noticed that how dangerous it was for them to hero worship me. They love bombed all of us. They pushed me up there to that position, and I say there's a little narcissist in every pastor, but the worst thing for a narcissist is to be on stage, because it just feeds that addiction. So to whatever degree I'm narcissistic, it fed that, and I became addicted to it. Just like the congregation is addicted to that message, that fear that gets instilled in them, and then there's a solution, and they like that rush.
And there's this addiction, at least from the churches that we pastored, that I saw, there's this addiction of, it's almost like a celebrity sort of thing. Like, you are the savior. You are going to come and rescue us. You are going to make this church viable again. And man, that leads to so... Yeah, that has a potential to lead to so much abuse. Yeah, it really does.
When we did a little bit, we almost always had some success in the churches. Then that just says, well, maybe I am great. I would never say that out loud, but maybe I am pretty good. Well,
it does make you feel good, right? And and I don't know that there's anything wrong with, receiving confirmation that you're doing a good job. I mean, we all want to be recognized for that. You kind of mentioned that a few minutes ago, but there's just that underlying. I mean, it could turn to a very destructive, abusive situation quickly if you're not aware of that.
We sometimes call it a learned codependency, and that's what we developed. So we became disillusioned with leaders, even as we were leaders in the church. We would see, 2 times during our ministry, we took time off and was at another church. One right after and one between the second and third church. And
so, like, just attending different churches,
of course,
not being
got involved pretty quickly, but just a disillusionment with leaders, that's a letdown. Of course, when you're pushing them up on the stage, that creates a separation, and then when you get disillusioned with them, it's so much worse. And I believe that creates some trauma, some stuff you got to get over.
Yeah, for sure.
I mean, when you're looking up to one of the pastors, then you disagree with them or something, and then they come at you, and you're like, wait, who are you? And those kind of things create problems.
Right. Yeah. So kind of another way that we experienced religious trauma was the whole love bomb, ignore, volunteer labor sort of thing. And I mean, we've kind of touched on that a little bit. Well, the whole love bomb thing, and we felt this not only as a new pastor and his family coming in, but also just when we stepped away from a church and would just go visit another church. I mean, people glom onto you really quickly. Like I said, when we would start at a new church, when you would be assigned as a pastor of that church, these churches were like 12 members. Like, they were about to shut their door. So these people, like...
It's not an exaggeration.
No, it's not.
The last one couldn't pay for postage when we got there.
Yeah. Which, we're all about, like, being helpful and, but the thing is they they love bomb you. And what I mean by that is like they literally just I don't know, I'm like, I can picture it in my head, but they're just all over you, and like you can do no wrong. At our last church, within 6 weeks of knowing somebody, I was supposedly their best friend. And we didn't even have that much, like I didn't even make or reciprocate the same contact with this person that she did with me, but somehow I was her best friend. But then what happens, and this happened at every church. Then when things, either simmer down after a while, or you have to maybe, I don't know, I don't want to say put your foot down about something, but maybe you have a conflict with someone, or you have to kind of maybe set the record straight about something, then it becomes where they ignore you. I mean, and that happened at every single church, and especially with me, they would strategically leave me out of things. And then when I would ask them, and it becomes very passive aggressive, because then when I would say, is something, are we okay? Did anything happen that I should know about? And they're just like, nope. No, and then they would just like literally that is all they would say, and then they would just go off and like start talking in their little cliques.
And it could be just ignoring you, like, okay, well, we've love bombed them, they're here, now there's a new visitor.
True. And
they just kind of move on. That's the other flavor of it.
You heard my trauma just come out then, because that was very, and that goes back into my childhood, and issues with my dad and things like that, abandonment issues. And so when people ignore me, and I'm not talking about like when we just attended church, I'm talking about when we were, when you were the pastor of these churches, and people would they would plan things and not include me. And I will be honest with you, to this day, I mean, I just came home yesterday and I just talked to you about how, there's times even in my job that I feel like I'm kind of the odd man out. I'm being left out. Or maybe I didn't share that with you, but I did share that with a friend of mine. And, so it still affects me today. Now, was that a trauma that occurred, like originated in the church? No, I will tell you right now that originated in my childhood. But what happened in the church like re-triggered that trauma and added to that trauma, because what they were doing was very much like what I had experienced in my childhood.
So we're going to talk a minute about how it's hard to fix that stuff. But one of the immediate things is always volunteer labor.
Right.
So I'm feeling left out. I'm voicing this concern. Well, you probably should just get involved. You need to get involved. You need to join a committee where you can do something, where you can provide us some volunteer labor. Oh, and by the way, you probably should start tithing also. So give us some money.
Give us money and work for us.
And you can work for us. Then that'll bring us together, and that'll help. And really kind of what it does is keeps you busy, so you don't have time to complain. That was snarky, by the way.
A little bit. That's okay.
But we asked the question then second. So that's kind of some trauma and ways we identify trauma. And
I wonder if people can I'm sorry, I didn't mean to interrupt you. Right. But I'm just wondering if people can hear that. That's the thing about trauma, though. It doesn't necessarily go away. I think you can work through it. But there are definitely going to be things that trigger that trauma to come back. Anyway, go ahead.
And hopefully now we've worked through some of it that it bothers us enough to speak up about it.
Right.
Talk about it honestly here.
That's a good point.
Hopefully.
Yeah.
But there's still some snark there because there's still some hurt there, and we're still working through it.
Well, yes, and there's hurt there, but it's also still happening.
Sure.
We're not in the church anymore, but it is still happening. I mean, I have had people kind of pull me to the side, in our small communities that we've been a part of, and say that they understand.
Yeah.
They understand because they've experienced it too.
Sure.
Anyway.
Absolutely. We hear a lot of stories.
Mm-hmm.
So, what made it hard? We're going to go through these kind of fast, but it's what made it hard when we realized it and we tried to heal it. So this would be while we're in the church, while we're involved in religious activities and so on. So the number one thing, probably most of all, is bypassing and dismissing. You heard a definition of bypassing earlier, but bypassing uses spiritual platitudes and things like that to just get past it, because tough things make us uncomfortable. We don't know what to say. We don't know what to do. And so just instead of sitting together or listening to each other, we dismiss it so we can get on into the service and get on with the thing we're trying to do today.
It. Yep.
Keep the trains running and so on. So that is a big one. And I'd recommend a book called Spiritual Bypassing by Robert Augustus Masters. Excellent book at describing how that works. And when you realize it, you'll look back on your religious experience and say, oh, I see now what happened.
Yeah. Also, you can't trust yourself.
Yeah.
That was a huge message. That was a huge message. You can't trust yourself. You can't trust your emotions. You can't trust your thoughts, your feelings, anything like that. And, it's just been recently that I've talked about this before. I might have even written about it. I can't remember. But, for the longest time, like most of our married life, probably even before that, I didn't want to show emotion. I didn't want to cry. I was told at some point in my life that was selfish. And so I never did trust that emotion. And now I do trust that in me, that if there is an emotion that is so strong that it's making me cry, whether it be happy, sad, disappointed, angry, whatever it is, that is okay. Those emotions are all okay. And I have found myself too reassuring other people, because the first thing, and especially women, what they will do when they start crying is they will say, oh, I'm sorry, I'm crying. And the first thing that comes out of my mouth anymore is, do not be sorry for your tears. Like, there's a purpose in those, and you need to let that out. I mean, it goes back to that bypassing. You sitting there saying that, oh, I'm so sorry, and I shouldn't be crying about this. Who says you shouldn't? You need to trust your emotions, and you need to trust the way you are feeling, because it's all correct for you.
Yeah. I think if we could have heard your intuition and believed it, and we'd have been a lot better off in a lot of situations. But we were just taught, don't trust your emotions. You're sinful. Your heart's deceitfully wicked. And we were just conditioned by the way the church ran. Don't make waves. Don't cause problems. Don't ask too many questions. Don't. You've mentioned before that you're afraid of ruining the ministry, by speaking up. And certainly I felt like I was ruining the ministry by speaking up at some times.
And certainly it didn't matter whether I spoke up or not, because I feel like there were times that I kind of took our ministry down. So
I said no time or money, personally or corporately, for dealing with trauma. If 10% of our personal money is going to the church at least, and all of our time and so on, there's no time or money for mental health. And corporately, as a church, there's usually not much devoted to mental health or trauma or anything like that.
Or it's like, it's Christian counseling,
right,
kind of thing.
And I know all churches intend to have good thoughts about that, but it usually doesn't get done.
So and then there's a lack of understanding, right? That trauma or whatever we're feeling is just sin.
Sin in your life,
right? It's sin in our life, and we need to examine that. We need to get right with God, all that stuff.
We mentioned another podcast we were listening to today about miracle thinking. And somehow, eventually, it's going to, either God's going to come back or, it's just going to go away. God's going to answer my prayer finally, and it's just going to go away. And the truth is, it doesn't.
And when we do that, we're not dealing.
That's right. We're not
with our stuff, right? We're just stuffing it down, bypassing it. We're not dealing with the real things that we need to be dealing with to help us be, healthier.
It is also a form of spiritual bypass.
For sure.
Right.
Yeah. And then we've talked about this one a lot, that the organization comes first.
Right.
I mean, we have beat that drum. But it is true. Like, and I've said it before and I'll say it again. Like, here's the deal. That's fine. But churches need to admit that they are an organization and that their organization comes first. Like, if you would just admit that, at least I would find you authentic and honest.
And then I wouldn't pay my tithe, and I would go put that into my mental health instead.
Exactly.
Because you're not going to deal with it. Because you got to keep the trains running. That's what matters most, more than the individual. Even though we care about the individual and we have good intentions,
it's like any corporation. Okay, like, think about when you had your stroke. Okay, the company that you were working for at the time had to keep the train running. So, did they care about you? Yes, to a point.
Right. They did some things.
Yes,
and
for sure.
Helpful, but they had a limit on what they could do.
Exactly.
Right.
Because they had to keep the train running.
And they couldn't hire me back because I wasn't useful enough.
Exactly.
For the organization.
Exactly.
So I call this the toddlers in charge, but here's what ends up happening. The narcissist is drawn to being on stage, that the people on stage generally don't get help. Just like when I was a pastor, there's no time for that.
Or there's a stigma involved in that,
right,
or
and
there's
it's going
shame.
Okay, and who can I tell,
right,
and all those things. So it ends up, the guys on stage are like toddlers in a way, and a lot of times people at mega churches, experience their pastors as real dynamic on stage, but in private, not that helpful, because they're in a small world, they're doing their thing and they're doing it well, but they haven't experienced relief from trauma, so they don't know how to explain it to you, right? They're going to spiritualize it. They're going to hope somebody else takes care of it or that a miracle happens, but they're generally not helpful,
right,
in that area, in my opinion.
Right. Yeah, and honestly, like, healing, realizing the trauma and healing, starting that healing journey, it's scary and hard.
Yeah.
It is. However, I want to put a disclaimer on that, because I feel like there are people that we've come in contact with that we know personally, us, you and I here in the Desert Sanctuary, that are willing to walk with people through that hard and difficult journey, that scary journey.
Yeah.
Because that was the hardest thing for me when we left church and I was just like, I'm done. And you do feel very alone. So just, yes, it is scary. Yes, it is hard, because you have to start really trying to understand and not beat yourself up for what you believed or did for so many years. But the beauty of that also, of that scary and hard journey, is that there are so many people that we can put you in touch with, that we know personally, that can walk alongside you.
Yeah. And it's worth it.
It is so worth it. It is so worth it.
So another barrier is that you may have to confront a person that's in charge. You may have to challenge long-held beliefs. And for most people, it ends up being, when I decide to face all this and move forward, I'm probably at least going to have to step back from my faith community, because it's long-standing beliefs. It's a business. It's an organization, and it's not just going to stop to walk alongside you, even though that's what they project.
And I will say that was kind of hard for me in a way, because when we did step away from the group, I mean, we have no one. I mean, we have no one that has really like stayed with us. That has,
except there's a fair amount of the children of people in our churches.
true.
And then I mean, stay with me as much. They're still Facebook friends.
Right.
They still talk to me.
Talk to you, sure.
And so on, and for the most part, a lot of them are deconstructing as well. But most of the adults, no,
No.
not at all.
No.
Because
I mean,
eventually you have a conversation, they'll say, Carl, let me just be clear. You don't believe in this, and you don't believe in this, and
We scare them.
that scares them. Yeah,
We scare them, and we don't intentionally try to scare them, but because we are where we are, that's scary. Like for me to say to somebody, I don't really know what I believe, and I don't know where I actually stand with the whole concept of God. That's scary for people to hear. But yeah, it's just funny. I was just thinking, it's probably 6, 7, 8 months after you had your stroke, and somebody from one of our last churches, like, what happened? I don't know. I must have posted something on, and but in the 5 years since we had been there, hadn't heard. I mean, talk about ghosting. Definitely ghosted by all the people, whether we were pastors there or whether we attended the churches there. We have been 100% ghosted by, I would say, 99% of the people. I will say I do have one really good friend from our very first church, and we don't necessarily believe in the same way, but we have a respect for each other and a love for each other, and we have stayed in contact all these years. We don't talk about religion, and that's okay. Like, there's plenty of other things to talk about besides that.
For sure. So what a lot of people talk about is the PTSD, the identity crisis you have when you leave organized religion or step away from it. There's definitely going to be a who am I, what do I do, what do I even like to do, what do I believe, and there is that frightening,
it can be scary,
very scary portion of it. And
but
then you find other people that can come up alongside you that have exactly the same experience, and you can tell each other stories and so on.
But also you can truly find out who you are, maybe for the very first time, and that is incredibly freeing. It really and truly is.
It involves getting comfortable with solitude for a little while. And when you do that, you can find that belonging instead of that fitting in, that Brene Brown talks about.
I think that's so important.
So how did we realize we had a problem? For me, everything that I had stuffed down, I write about it in the Being book, everything I had tried to stuff down came out all at once. It was all my shadow and so on. So
that's a really good book, and that was a really, really dark time for us. As a married couple. And so I appreciate your vulnerability in publishing that book, because it's probably taken me even to just, recently to not still feel some hurt from that, because that was a really dark time for us.
Indeed.
Yeah.
And it had come, on the heels of me learning to go inside, and that's the part about going inside, is that, that's where I'm going to find my authentic self. That's where I'm going to find my intuition. That's where I'm going to connect with divine and so on, all those things. But it's also where you find your trauma, and until you address that in your body, and I would say the big time was that incident when I wrote Being in that time period. But then now, as I deal with the stroke, we're dealing with new situations, then I find another layer.
Yep.
And well, on one side it makes my life better, the other side is hard.
Yeah.
And it needs to be confronted, and it is not easy. Takes a lot of introspection, a lot of time alone thinking about it, but also some good counseling, some hypnosis, some shadow work, and all those. We'll talk about those a little bit in a minute. But yeah, it's
so, like, when I look back on it now, like, it was really, really hard in that moment, and for many weeks after that. And we've had to have some really hard conversations, but through that, you go through the process of really learning who you are. And that is, like, so important, because that, for us in the church, got lost, got buried. And you have to uncover that. You have to uncover that if you're going to live your true, authentic self.
You're going to live a real life.
Yeah.
And have real joy, real peace, real communication.
Yeah, not the mask
right
of joy and peace, but really, and that's the thing I really appreciate about our relationship now, is that, we can call each other on the bullshit that we see in each other, like, and that's
so
a good
funny
thing.
The other day
that's
when
a good thing.
You said you seem kind of dysregulated now.
I love that word, and I use it, and I actually used it in my classroom the other day, like, and I have a specific place in my classroom for kids that become dysregulated, because we all become dysregulated. We do. And, like, knowing that is that's totally okay. It's totally okay. And we have to have that time where we can re-regulate and figure out, like, what is our truth. And
now the difference is reacting and responding, and so now we respond. Now it's more of, wait a minute, Karl, this is happening. This, I think we need to address this, and it's a response to it instead of a reaction that just spirals into a 2-day long fight,
right?
And never resolves the issue or the trauma or the relationship and things like that.
And one thing I think, because of all the work that you've done, something that, and how long have we been married? 35 years. Something that's at least something that you do now that and this isn't like, this isn't a stab at you or anything like that, but something that you do that you didn't do for 34 years is you, like, actually genuinely are apologetic.
I agree.
When this just happened the other night, and I felt like I wasn't being listened to, and I wasn't being heard, and I was feeling cut off, but it's genuine. It's not like, well, I'm sorry, sorry I hurt your feelings. There's just a genuineness about that. It's, instead of having that ego attached to, the apology, if you know what I mean, like, where you're apologetic, but you're not really, because it's like, well, I guess I'm just a screw up, somehow it's kind of twisted, it's not like that anymore.
And I think my trauma goes back a long ways.
Oh, I think mine does too.
And you've mentioned yours does too. So it's going to take some work, and it's going to not be easy, but like we always say, it's going to be worth it. And for me, it's definitely worth it. And quality of life's better, and we operate better together.
Right.
So let's talk about some practical steps. This is our last thing.
Okay.
It won't take long.
All right.
But
you're always on a time schedule.
I know.
I am not.
I say develop an internal practice.
Okay.
In some way, find out how to go inside. whether that's through meditation or stillness or centering prayer or maybe hypnosis, but maybe shadow work with a spiritual director that's trauma-informed, a good counselor that's trauma-informed, therapist that can help you go inside, because until we get inside, we don't get to know our authentic self. We don't know how to pay attention to how we feel, where we feel it, those type of things. That's leads into the second thing, which you could tell.
Yeah. So a couple really good books, and I've only read one of these. I read the Body Keeps the Score. But
you've seen the impact of the other one, because I read the other one.
Right, and that's Bringing Your Shadow Out of the Dark. But let me speak to The Body Keeps the Score a little bit, because until I read this book, I did not realize how much trauma I was holding on to. Like, your trauma goes to a cellular level. I mean, your body remembers that. We can try to stuff it. We can try to cover it. We can try to do all these things so we don't think about it.
Yeah.
But your body still knows the trauma that you have experienced, and it does not forget. And so the sooner we can acknowledge it and deal with it with trained professionals who are trauma informed, the better off we're going to be. Now, yes. So Bringing Your Shadow Out of the Dark, was that the book that you read in the Hermitage?
Yeah. So when in the Being book, when I was in the Hermitage and dealing with all this shadow stuff, and someone told me you should do some shadow work, and I got that book on Kindle that day and pulled it up on my laptop and just sat in the Hermitage and read it and outlined it and underlined it and everything else. And it kind of a general little process that he talks about in there of inner child work that I was able to do by myself, and then followed up the next day with other people. Changed my life. It got me on this path of it's okay to acknowledge your feelings, and by doing that, you're going to get to the root of the problem, and you're going to find out what your body's trying to tell you, and what trauma's hidden there that needs to come out.
So my question is, in the Being book, because it's been a while since you read it to me and through the editing process and everything, did you talk about like the whole situation that brought you to the Hermitage? Did you talk about like the situation that happened with us that...
Yeah.
So literally, just to kind of give our listeners just a brief summary, something happened. We had a huge, like almost up all night fight. The next day I went to work and I got a text message from you saying, I'm going to Atchison, Kansas to the Hermitage, which I took as he's leaving me. And it amazes me even now just talking about it, how like you literally went there that day because you couldn't focus on your work or anything like that. So you went there that day, you read that, and by the next day I got a text message from you, and it was like you were a totally different person.
Yeah.
Like something really transformed in you. Now, I was a little more skeptical being on, the receiving end of that text, because I was just like, you want to leave me? Let's go, buddy.
So, and it was the program that I was in was a spiritual direction development program, and it was with some Benedictine sisters. And I had done several sessions with Sister Marcia. She's very good. She's awesome. And she, would try to talk to me about going inside and so on. And I was trying, but I was always
something
trying.
Was blocking it.
Yeah, and I was always trying to tell her what I'm doing good, or how, what I did that week. And she's getting a little frustrated, but she didn't. She just barely showed it. But then over that weekend when your sister was here and I talk about all that, and it wasn't anything significant that happened. It was just all of a sudden I'm bolted
whatever
out
happened
of the house.
Triggered your trauma.
Right, and it all came to the surface all at once. It felt like the beach ball I was trying to keep down just came up and I couldn't get it back down again. And then I tried going back to work and, was just avoiding meetings and trying to figure out what I was going to do because I didn't know what to do, but I knew I had to do something. And so I came home and packed a few clothes, and we were going to have a session that next weekend. So I got permission to stay at the Hermitage that week. And you're right, in a day or so, things changed and started
pretty amazing
to be where, I learned to access that inner child and told him very simply, I got your back. And it just, just weeping. And I described it as being reborn, and I want to avoid magical language like...
or spiritual.
Like I prayed and all of a sudden it was better, because that's not what happened.
No.
But then the next thing we're going to talk about, the next day, several of the women that were in that group, I went back to the main hall, and when they got back in session, then I told them my story. And I think that's another...
Can I just tell you that the thing I really appreciated about them, and you told me this, and it's not that I needed like some sort of validation or pat on the back, but when you tried to blame me, okay, I'm so glad we're on the same page. When you tried to blame me, they were like,
that's bullshit.
Yep. Yeah. Nope. You're taking responsibility for this.
Yeah.
And Dr. Paul did that too. And it's not that I got some sort of pleasure from that, because I really didn't. But there's something about that I really appreciate, because I think maybe for the first time in forever, I realized that I'm not responsible for your reaction to things. Like that was the first time that I realized that I'm not responsible for your reaction.
Right.
Like that's your stuff and you need to deal with it.
And all through it, you kept telling me, I'll own up to my stuff.
Yeah.
And that left me with having to deal with mine.
Yep.
And so that's what I was trying to figure out there. And of course, I'm cognitive. I want to think about it and figure it out mentally.
Right.
But then finally, I was able to get inside myself and experience that inner child and just say, I got your back.
Yeah.
And it's like my life started flashing before my eyes. And it was
crazy, isn't it?
And I wept, and then I slept, and then I...
it was exhausting.
Made breakfast
it's exhausting
and stared
work.
at the wall. Yeah.
It's exhausting work, but it's so worth it, like you said.
But then I think what helps, the next thing is to tell your story.
Yeah.
And I immediately went to some of those people in that program and told them my story.
And they're safe people to tell it to.
Yeah, they didn't judge me. They didn't go, well, what you need to do next is this. They just listened.
Yeah.
And validated how I was feeling. And
they allowed you to own your story and not like it was yours.
Yeah.
Right? It had nothing to do with me. I wasn't responsible for those aspects of your story. That was your story to own and to deal with. And I think that was so good. But are there guidelines, though, for telling your story? Because I think that's really important to mention.
Yeah, and I think you have taught me that people have to earn the right to hear your story. And you've got to feel that you can trust them.
Absolutely.
And I think these days, I would stop people if they started giving me advice when I'm telling them my story. That's not what I need.
That's not what I need.
What I need is for you to hear me and believe me.
Yep.
And that's what the abuse survivors need and so on. But it helps to tell our story. In fact, one of the people at the conference is going to talk about the value of telling your story.
Cool.
and how to come out with your story and things like that.
Yeah, and so, when you do that, I think you can learn to trust yourself. You can recognize your own intuition and that your intuition is valid and your intuition is something that you can trust.
Yeah, and like you talked about earlier, learning to regulate, right? Breathing, pausing.
Yeah.
Even when some of that old anxiety comes up, and is taking a breath, regulating, and yoga, helps with that. Meditation helps with that. But it all boils down to learning to breathe, right?
Yeah.
And taking a pause before you react.
Yeah, and I think recognizing your breath is so important, because I think when you finally start to do that, you realize like how many times when we're in states of stress that we actually hold our breath, or we don't breathe with that flow, I guess. At least that's been my experience.
Yeah. And the downstairs brain and so on, that you use as references, I think that breathing helps you get back into you call it the upstairs brain. Right?
That's like your prefrontal cortex. Yeah.
So regulation is good.
For sure. Yeah, and doing that shadow work like you talked about, and finding a spiritual director that is trauma informed. I think the whole trauma informed part is really important. If you've had, significant trauma, you need to find somebody that is trauma informed. Yeah.
Don't, I wrote down, don't counsel with the group that traumatized you. Those in authority over you, or because it may not be authentic when you work that way. Someone's going to be an authority over you by default. And biblical counseling, we can just about dismiss outright, unless it's trauma informed, unless it understands Jung and some later methodologies, whatever I'm trying to say. That biblical counseling just tends to be, kind of the whim of whoever's spouting it, or what verses they remember or things like that.
Or how they translate them, or, maybe translate's not the best word, but how they interpret them, right?
And I even went to a coaching, spiritual leadership coaching was what it was. I almost graduated until I had to tell them my beliefs were changing. But the solution was still always read your Bible, pray, and go to church. And that's not the kind of therapy, that's not the kind of help you need when you're trying to do trauma work.
Right.
So just a word of warning.
Yeah. Something that's kind of like, I don't know, I had to learn this, was like, don't be bullied into forgiveness, doing more, like suffering for the cause kind of thing. I think the whole like bullied into forgiveness, because that is a big thing. I think especially in organized religion, that if you're really spiritual, if you're really following Christ, God, whatever, then you should forgive people. To me, forgiveness I look at that differently now. So like, I think that, and I've talked about this several times, I have a past with my dad. I have forgiven him, but that has changed the boundaries of our relationship significantly.
Right.
And as far, but here's my thing. Like, if you're not ready to forgive, then don't. Like, find what makes you happy. And I don't know, I don't think we can force people or guilt people into forgiveness. That is so unhealthy. Doing more, all that does is keeps us busy, and we just then can, for a time, ignore that trauma. But like what happened to you in the Hermitage, or what happened to us that night, it wasn't even in the Hermitage. It happened like the night before, it's gonna resurface. Like, you cannot stuff it down forever. And doing more and staying busy is a hustle, but that trauma is going to catch up with you because, like we said earlier, your body is going to keep the score. Your body remembers. And so sometime down the road, that trauma is going to resurface, and it's going to like slap everybody around you upside the head.
Yeah.
So there's no glory in suffering.
Right.
There's no glory in suffering.
Right.
I think about all the time wasted that I felt like, well, I just need to suffer for the cause or whatever. And it's like, I just don't believe that is a way that God, Christ, the divine, whatever, intended for us to live in this perpetual suffering.
There's kind of a core concept in all this that gets missed sometimes. I think a lot of times when we're doing inner child work, we're hesitant to have compassion for our inner child because we have a critic.
Oh, for sure.
Right? But then, like, since you're a teacher, if you frame that, well, how would I treat a young child in my class that had suffered the same thing?
Right.
Or if someone in the church had done the same thing to your child that they did to you, how would you feel? Well, you would want to set some boundaries.
Yeah, I'm not going to let them suffer.
Separate, and I'm going to try to help my child get better.
Right.
But we tend to not want to do that for ourselves.
Yeah.
Because we think we have to suffer, or we think we have to be overly forgiving and unconditionally loving and just let it go. And then God's going to fix them. God will take care of them. But they may be re-traumatizing us, and we may not be getting better because we're still right in the middle of it. We're still trying to busy ourselves, into holiness or something.
Right.
I don't know. As we said before, learn to experience solitude. If you have to step away from something and all of a sudden you're not around as many people anymore and so on, learn to experience solitude and find. I do it through writing. When I'm alone and quiet, then it spurs my writing, and that helps me think, help me know what I think. So,
journaling, meditation, that kind of stuff is really good. And then don't try to save or re-enter the toxic place. Maybe ask them to join you. So I know that is something, and we've joked about it, but I will say in all seriousness, I cannot see me ever going back into organized religion. It would have to change in a drastic way for me to do that.
Yeah, and it's not bitterness, I don't think.
No.
I mean, I don't think we sit around being bitter.
No, but I think I just have learned to. I think I've learned to love myself enough to set that boundary and just say that this is the place that created some toxicity, but also, what is the word I'm looking for? Kind of reinforced maybe some of the trauma that I grew up with.
Right.
So for me to enter that again, until that place is no longer toxic, I'm not going to do that to myself because I care about myself now more than I ever have before.
Yeah, that's good.
Yeah.
So we're done. What are your final thoughts?
This has been good.
Yeah, what would you say to people that are listening in? We didn't prepare for that.
It's a lot. We've kind of covered a lot of things. I guess what I really want to say is, like, we don't know where people are that are listening to this podcast. And so, like, I guess I want to say for me, I won't speak for you. I want to say for me, like, wherever you are, like, if you're still in organized religion and you don't feel like you can leave, like, we totally honor wherever you are. It may not be where we are, but I also want people to know, like, we're here. We're here for, like, if you just need to talk or, even just not silently, but secretively maybe no one else knows, but you need to just say, I see it too. I can't leave. I'm a pastor's wife. I'm a pastor. I'm a pastor's kid, whatever. And I can't leave it. I can't walk away from it. But I see it. I guess for me, that would have been helpful to have that validation when we first left organized religion, because it was so incredibly lonely. And I felt like no one else feels the way I do.
Yeah.
And I guess I want to give that hope that we understand if it's not something you can walk away from right now. We totally get that. Yeah. Because I think it took a long time for us to do that as well, because that was part of our livelihood. It was. But I guess just I want people to know that we are here. There are other people that we know that totally get wherever you are and that are with you too. And we're not going to try to talk you in or out of anything. I think we've come a long way in that, because I think at first, when we first started this podcast, I will say for me, I was kind of bitter. And I'm like, I'm just going to tell people, get out, get out. But it's like, but we understand now that that's not always the case. But we are also two people that are here to listen and to, validate where you're at.
Yeah, I would say maybe invest some of your tithe or all of your tithe in mental health counseling. Use your employee assistance program to see if you can get connected with a trauma-informed counselor. And when we have the conference, some of these people are authors that have outstanding books and outstanding information. Start studying some of that information where you can take charge of your own recovery.
Right.
And begin that process. Unfortunately, what's probably going to happen is you're going to grow past the congregation that you're in, and they won't be able to relate to you, and you may have to leave. But once you start making yourself a priority, and like Laura said, your healing a priority, we believe you can get better. I believe that all people can make progress wherever they are. So we encourage you to do that. Reach out to us and join us on December 9th. As always, be where you are, be who you are, and be at peace.
Thank you for joining us today on the Desert Sanctuary.
Remember, all that wander in the desert are not lost. We hope that you know
you are seen,
you are heard,
and you are loved.